They told Appalachia the coal companies were finally gone after a century of extraction, a century of corporate land ownership, company towns, scrip wages, black lung, and mountains blasted apart for the coal inside them. The mines were closing. The last major coal operation in the Clear Fork Valley on the Kentucky-Tennessee border closed in 2022. Across central Appalachia, coal production had fallen by 75% since 2011 and taken 70% of the coal jobs with it. The industry that had defined the region, controlled its land, suppressed its wages, and extracted its wealth for over 100 years was finally retreating. What nobody told Appalachia was who was coming in behind it, because the land did not sit empty when the coal companies left. The deeds changed hands, the ownership transferred, and the new buyers, tech companies, hedge funds, investment management firms, environmental finance organizations, moved into the same hills, bought the same acres, locked the same gates, and started generating the same kind of returns from Appalachian land that the coal companies had generated for a century. They just changed what they were extracting. Instead of coal, they are extracting carbon credits. And the people who live in the mountains cannot tell the difference from the outside. Subscribe right now, hit the button and the bell. To understand what is happening, you have to understand what a carbon credit actually is, because the language around it is designed to sound like conservation while functioning like a financial instrument. When a major corporation like Microsoft or Google generates carbon dioxide emissions through its data centers, manufacturing, and operations, it faces mounting pressure, regulatory, investor, and reputational, to offset those emissions. One mechanism for doing that is purchasing carbon credits. A carbon credit represents a measured quantity of carbon dioxide that has been sequestered or prevented from entering the atmosphere somewhere else. If a forest is left standing rather than logged, the trees absorb carbon. That absorbed carbon can be measured, certified by an approved methodology, and sold as credits to a corporation that uses the purchase to claim its emissions have been offset elsewhere. The carbon credit market is now worth tens of billions of dollars annually and growing. California runs the largest compliance carbon market in the Americas, and companies subject to California emissions regulations are required to purchase offsets for emissions they cannot eliminate. The demand is structural, and it is large. And the place that has become one of the most valuable sources of carbon credits in the United States, specifically the most valuable source of forest-based carbon offsets, is the same place the coal companies just left: Appalachian forests. Specifically the former mine lands, the stripped mountains, the degraded hollows of eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, and West Virginia are being enrolled in carbon offset programs at a scale that most people in Appalachia have not been told about. Microsoft agreed to purchase 1.4 million tons of carbon removal credits from 25,000 acres of former Appalachian mine land from a company called Living Carbon. Google, Meta, McKinsey, and Salesforce formed a coalition in 2024 called the Symbiosis Coalition, committed specifically to buying carbon removal credits from Appalachian reforestation projects, pledging contracts for up to 20 million tons by 2030. The Nature Conservancy, operating through an investment fund called NatureVest, purchased over 200,000 acres of former coal land in central Appalachia. These transactions are presented as sustainability initiatives, healing the land that coal destroyed, restoring ecosystems, fighting climate change. And there is genuine ecological value in some of what is happening. Forests growing on strip-mined land is objectively better than strip-mined land sitting bare. The trees are real. The carbon absorption is real, but the people living in the mountains are describing something different from what the press releases say. Here is what the residents of the Clear Fork Valley on the Kentucky-Tennessee border say is actually happening. For generations, longer than anyone currently living can remember, the families in that valley walked those forests freely. They hunted there, they gathered ginseng there, which in Appalachia is not a hobby, but a source of real income for families with limited other options. Ginseng collected in the wild and sold to buyers has supplemented household incomes in the Appalachian hills since before the coal companies arrived. They collected firewood for heating, they fished the streams. They use the land the way people use land they have lived beside for a century, through a social understanding with the corporate owners that the forests were accessible even when technically owned by someone else. When NatureVest purchased the land in 2019, following the earlier enrollment by the previous corporate owner, Malpus Woodlands Group, into carbon offset programs in 2015, making a 125-year carbon sequestration commitment. That social arrangement ended. The land was now an environmental asset with a financial return to manage. Access began to require permits. Fees were introduced for hunting, hiking, and recreation. The old informal paths into the forest became subject to the same no trespassing enforcement that governed the coal company land before it. One resident told researchers documenting the transition, "For 3 generations, my family has been able to walk and use that land, but now I could be arrested for entering it without a permit." Another described it plainly, "The language is different, the story is not." Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this story matters. The carbon credit math explains why. NatureVest's purchase generated at least $20 million in proceeds from the sale of carbon offsets from the Clearfork Valley land. The landowners enrolled in smaller regional carbon programs earn approximately $230 per acre over 20 years, roughly $11 per acre per year. The corporate buyers of those credits are paying into a compliance market where credits trade at prices that make the payments to Appalachian landowners look like a rounding error. The wealth generated by Appalachian land in the carbon credit era flows outward with the same efficiency it did in the coal era. There is also a tax dimension that receives almost no coverage. Corporate timberland in Appalachia is classified as managed timberland and assessed at artificially low values because the land rarely changes hands on the open market. It transfers between corporate entities through deals that do not establish comparable market pricing. The result, documented by researchers who have studied Appalachian County finances, is that corporate landowners pay minimal property taxes on vast holdings. Local homeowners bear a disproportionate share of the tax burden. School budgets, road maintenance, health services, the public infrastructure that Appalachian communities depend on are funded primarily by the people who own the least land rather than the corporations that own the most. The ownership structure of Appalachian land has not fundamentally changed in over 100 years. It has changed in form, from coal companies to timber investment management organizations to environmental finance funds, but the pattern underneath is the same one a landmark survey documented in 1981. The Appalachian Land Ownership Task Force spent 2 years in the late 1970s mapping who actually owned the land across 80 counties in 6 Appalachian states. Their findings, published in a 7-volume, 1,800-page report, confirmed what residents had always understood. 40% of the land and 70% of the mineral rights were held by corporations. Of the land owned by individuals, less than half was owned by local individuals. The region that had sustained some of the most economically productive extraction in American history had generated almost none of the resulting wealth for the people who lived inside it. By 1810, before the coal era even began, 93% of the land in what is now West Virginia was already held by absentee owners. The pattern of outside ownership is not a consequence of the coal industry. It predates it. The coal industry inherited and deepened an ownership structure that had been established by land speculators who arrived before the railroads, bought mineral rights from families who could not read the contracts they were signing, and left the surface rights to people who discovered decades later that they owned the dirt but not what was underneath it. The wealth was always in the underneath. The people above it were the labor force, not the beneficiaries. Researchers who revisited the Appalachian land ownership data 25 years after the original survey found that concentrated and absentee ownership had persisted through every economic transition the region experienced. Coal companies became timber companies. Timber companies became TIMOs, timber investment management organizations, financialized entities that manage forests as investment portfolios for institutional investors. TIMOs now own the largest share of corporate land in Appalachia. They replaced the coal companies not because Appalachian communities gained political power or because policy changed. But because the coal seams thinned and the carbon markets opened, the extraction machinery updated its product. The ownership structure was already in place, waiting for the next resource cycle to begin. A 2013 study of West Virginia land ownership found that in Wyoming County, the state's most corporately owned county, just 10 landowners held 75% of the county's private land. 2 companies alone, Heartwood Forest Land Company and Norfolk Southern, owned more than 50% of the county. Wyoming County has a poverty rate well above the state average, which itself ranks among the highest in the nation. The correlation between concentrated absentee land ownership and persistent poverty in Appalachian counties is one of the most thoroughly documented relationships in American regional economics. It has been documented since 1981. Nothing about it has changed. In one county in central Appalachia, a conservation entity now controls more than 200,000 acres under a sustainability banner. That is not a small parcel. That is an area larger than some small states' entire protected land systems. It is managed for carbon sequestration, selective timber harvest, and recreation. Recreation for which access permits and fees are now required. Locals compare the experience directly to the coal company era. They couldn't use it then. They can't use it now. The difference is that the coal companies did not claim to be healing the mountains. The carbon credit buyers do. The dissonance between the marketing language and the lived experience of the people in those hills is one of the things that makes this story harder to tell than the straightforward extraction story of the coal era. Coal was visibly destructive. Carbon credits are marketed as repair. The gates closing around the forests look like conservation from a distance, and like the same locked gate from the front porch. The people watching this from Appalachian front porches and farm trucks are not confused about what is happening. They have seen it before, not the specific mechanism. The carbon credits, the LLC, registered in Delaware, the investment fund structured to generate returns for institutional pension managers. But the underlying arrangement, outside money identifying value in Appalachian land, acquiring it through instruments the local population does not fully understand, and generating returns that leave the region while leaving behind whatever costs the extraction imposed. What changed is the story told to justify it. In the coal era, the justification was jobs and economic growth, a justification that proved hollow for most of the region over most of the century. In the carbon credit era, the justification is climate and sustainability, a justification that proves equally hollow for the families who can no longer walk into the forests their grandparents walked through without paying a permit fee to a corporation headquartered in San Francisco. A researcher who spent years documenting the Clear Fork Valley transition described what she found in a phrase that cuts through the marketing. The power lies elsewhere, and the profits rarely stay in the places where they begin. That sentence could have been written in 1920. It was written in 2025. The mountains have not moved. Neither has the pattern. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. Drop a comment. Did you know about the carbon credit land grab in Appalachia? Because the coal companies left, the story did not. Thank you for watching. The truth doesn't shout. It waits for you to look closer.